Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our viewers from Hampstead Garden Suburb Synagogue, to our viewers from Woodside Park Synagogue, to our viewers from the United Synagogue, to our viewers from Anglo Jewry, to our viewers from across the world. Tonight we have the fourth installment of our Rabbinic Chavrusa in memory of Rabbi Lord Sacks, Zatzal Zecher Tzadik Livracha, of blessed memory. Each month, we look at another book from Rabbi Sacks in conversation with a rabbi from Anglo Jewry. Tonight, it is my honor to be in conversation with Rabbi Pinny Hackenbroch of Woodside Park Synagogue. Rabbi Hackenbroch has taken the gargantuan task, the courageous task of discussing tonight the dignity of difference, probably Rabbi Sacks's most famous book. Welcome, Rabbi Hackenbroch.
Good evening, Rabbi Friedman, and good evening to everyone at Norris Lee. It is an absolute pleasure and privilege to be with you and to have the opportunity to have a chavrusa.
Well, thank you.
To be able to share ideas and thoughts and be in conversation with you, Rabbi Friedman. I personally owe so much, as we all do, to Rabbi Lord Sacks. He inducted me twice in 2003 when I became the rabbi in Newton Mearns in Glasgow, and again in 2008. And he came quite frequently to Woodside Park. Of course, he grew up round the corner from the shul in Finchley, went to school nearby, and he was somebody who really lived up to the virtues and values that he stood for. And he was somebody who we all were inspired by his thoughts, his ideals, but also by the way that he lived and breathed the virtues and values that he stood for. Now, why did I choose this book? Well, that's something I'm still asking myself. It is probably the magnum opus of Rabbi Sacks's works. It certainly is a book which is much discussed around the world and is one of the books that is certainly challenging in so many ways and so many levels. I will share with you a little story just as way of background as to when the book really resonated with me. I had my signed edition from Rabbi Sacks when he came to visit for the induction, and I recall that I was invited to Hampden Park a few years after I was in Glasgow, and I was invited to take part in an interfaith event. It was Show Racism the Red Card. And what they had arranged were 4 groups of kids. There was Protestants from a Protestant school, there were Catholics, there were kids from the local Jewish school, and there were Muslim kids. And the idea was that they would get together once a week, hear an idea from a faith leader, and then they'd be able to play football together and be able to get on. And I volunteered to take part on the first week. And so I gave this beautiful idea relating to many of the themes we'll be discussing tonight. And then the idea was that the kids should play football, mix up with each other, and have a lot of fun. Anyways, long story short, we thought we may have some trouble with the Muslim and the Jewish kids. There was a lot of tension at that time. That wasn't the issue. In Glasgow, the old firm was very, very passionate. And therefore, when it came to the Protestant and the Catholic children playing and mixing up and playing as a team together, that was the greatest challenge. But that little microcosm, those 4 groups of kids, and being able to eventually learn to play together and to find that they could be on the same team and work together, it very much resonated with me. And it's something that stayed with me throughout the interfaith work that I have done. So the ideas that we're going to discuss tonight relating to the dignity of faith and the ideas which are all about collaborating, working together, respecting the differences, and being emboldened by the differences, as well as celebrating the commonality, is something that I hold so dear, and I'm very much looking forward to sharing and to discussing with Rabbi Friedman.
Well, thank you very much, Rabbi Hackenbroch. That sounds so interesting, and really, by the sound of things, laid the groundwork for the incredible interfaith clergyman, that interfaith leader that you have become today. And just like Rabbi Sacks, I think sometimes we misinterpret Rabbi Sacks as this leader for everyone, but he was very much leader for everyone, but ambassador of the Jewish people. And interfaith work involves that give and take, that dialogue, that it's a communication. It's not just simply, this is our message and we're putting it out there, but it's a back and forth, a to and fro, and no doubt you embody many of the great character traits that Rabbi Lord Sacks Zatzal taught us in terms of interfaith work. So I'm going to start with chapter 3, if I may. And chapter 3, in The Dignity of Difference, Rabbi Sacks talks about the ghost of Plato. He says the issue why we don't understand one another and we don't understand the role of religion, and we think that religion is only a destructive force, is because we in the West, we think in Platonic terms. See, for Plato, the world was all about order versus chaos, truth versus falsehood. So if truth equals order and chaos equals falsehood, then the goal in life is to strive towards finding that truth, seeking that order. So if I'm getting to a point where I am able to find that order in amongst the chaos, find the truth, then everything else must be false in comparison. Therefore, truth must be universal. If we come with that attitude, then we're liable to problems, because it means that only my truth that I have found can be ultimate for everyone. It must be the only answer. And if you have some other answer, then you are living a lie. You are living in a life of chaos. And with that attitude, we're bound to have division in this world and major conflict. According to Rabbi Sacks, universalism is just as dangerous as tribalism. So there are those that accuse religions of being the source of conflict in the world. And certainly Rabbi Sacks later develops this in Not in God's Name. But this notion of tribes being in conflict with one another, and therefore let's rid the world of particularism. He says, if we're working towards universalism, we are going to have the same problems. He says, many a time in history, there have been attempts at universalism that have failed because they fail to recognize and honor and tolerate the particulars that exist in the system. He says that the Bible is the greatest anti-Plato statement. God's statement in the Bible, at least the way Judaism has always understood it, is that Judaism isn't for everyone. That the message God gives to a particular nation is not the same message that God is giving to everyone. So when we have the birth of our people, not yet called Jews, probably called Hebrews, later become Israelites, and only later become Jews, but that first birth of Avram HaIvri, Abraham the Hebrew, at the same time, we can still have a conversation that he has with Melchizedek, the king of Shalem. V'hu kohen le'el elyon. He is a priest to the God of Most High. What do you mean? Was he a Hebrew? Was he of the same faith as Abraham? Where does he fit into the picture? Rabbi Sacks wants to suggest that, yes, he could worship the same God, but not necessarily in exactly the same manner that Abraham is, and be outside of that realm of Abraham's covenant. God, says Rabbi Sacks, is the God of all humanity. But, in Rabbi Sacks' words, no single faith is the faith of all humanity. I guess what he means is no single religion is the religion of all humanity, yet it's the same God. He says the God of the Bible is not Platonist. God chooses Isaac and yet is able to have blessing for Ishmael. God chooses Jacob and yet has blessing for Esau. Doesn't exclude them. Doesn't say, well, if you're not choosing this path, then you're cursed. No, there's blessing even beyond the borders of this Hebraic succession and tradition. He talks about the three struggles of Moses. Moses first struggles when he sees the Egyptians smiting his Hebrew brother. There's another struggle when he sees the Hebrew brothers fighting amongst themselves. And then there's a further struggle when he sees something completely external to him, the shepherds of Midian attacking the Midianite girls, one of whom later becomes his wife, Zipporah. These are struggles that are all part of our tradition, struggles that come from outside that attack us, struggles within our community, and struggles that are external to our community, all of which are our concerns. But unless we are able to distinguish between each of these struggles, we can't understand this system that God has in place of particularism and universalism, both of which are integral. Now, he says we learn universalist kindness by means of particularist kindness. Here's an example he gives. He says, it's very important to look after the children of the world, but you can only truly appreciate the role of a parent and the needs of a child by being a parent yourself. When you are a parent, you're able to understand the needs of parenting and the needs of a child in terms of having parents. It's only through a particularist personal model that I'm able to understand how to deal with others in the same situation, in that same model. He says Passover, Pesach, is not only our festival of freedom, but it's also the festival where we remember what it's like to be a slave. That's important. We can't appreciate the suffering of the other unless we're constantly reminding ourselves what that means, how we ourselves experience that. Not just looking at it as, okay, they must be suffering. How must they feel? No. We need to remind ourselves, we had that feeling. How did it feel? Each generation, one must think of oneself as if you yourself left Egypt. What does that mean? We know the Pesach Seder begins with Poschem B'Gnus. We start with the suffering. We don't go straight to the bliss and wonderful part of the story, the freedom. No, we start by trying to remind ourselves with the maror, with the charoses that represents those bricks and mortar with which we built. We're trying to instill in our children that feeling of suffering. Only then can we empathize with someone who is suffering. He says that tribalism denies rights to the outsider, but universalism denies rights unless you are prepared to convert and become an insider. He gives countless examples of universalism that purported to be tolerant and yet could not tolerate Judaism. Antiochus during the Greeks wanted everybody to be Hellenistic. That was the tolerance. If we were all simply the same, we could tolerate. But it didn't work. The Roman Empire wanted everyone to be a certain way and ended up destroying the temple because that tolerance couldn't withstand, couldn't respect the particularism of Jewish practice. He says, ultimately, says Rabbi Sachs, we must believe that there's a universalism in Judaism that's defined by the Noahide code, and then a particularism, a particular covenant that God makes with us, and different styles that God has with everyone else in the world, however they express their connection, their relationship with the Almighty, as long as they are within that Noahide universal code, then we are all fulfilling our mission. So just a personal note, the only thing that I struggle with is, of course, that the assumption built into that is our story, our narrative of Noahidism and a universal code that presupposes the particular covenant that God makes with Abraham. Our message is still something that's universalist, that we are now telling the world, well, there are things like you can't worship idols, you must believe in monotheism. Right? So pieces like that we have to still be very careful about, that I wonder what Rabbi Sacks would say in terms of conflict between Noahidism and certain other religions and practices. Rabbi Hackenbrach, I welcome your thoughts.
Thank you. So are we moving on to chapter 4, or are we?
Well, do we want to spend a couple of minutes discussing some of the ideas?
Sure. So do you want to start us off, Rabbi Friedman?
Well, from those ideas, I mean, I've thrown out a question now, I guess, about Noahidism as a particularist way of viewing the world. What would you think Rabbi Sacks would say about polytheistic religions? I mean, clearly he's comfortable with the Abrahamic faiths. He speaks about that often throughout his books. In your experience in interfaith work, what do you make of the polytheistic religions?
Well, the interesting thing is, and I'm sure we'll come to this later, he didn't differentiate regarding the polytheistic faiths. He didn't actually discuss that when there was this whole controversy and debate. So I would presume he incorporates it as along with the other faiths. He didn't make any distinction. But we have the covenants, which you've already touched upon, the Noahide covenant, which all peoples are a part of. And then we have what we have, which is afterwards, subsequent to that, the Abrahamic covenant, which we are a part. So each faith, from Rabbi Sacks's perspective, has its covenant, has its own unique place and relationship with God. And there are seem to be different ways between reaching God and each particular nation. Bearing in mind, of course, that I think the analogy that he gives at somewhere in the book is the idea of a parent and a child. You know, if you ask the child says, "Do you love me, Mummy?" And then the mother will say, "I love you. Of course I love you. You're everything to me." And the next child comes along and will say, "What about me? You love him, and what about me?" And the mother will say, "I love you absolutely." So one is not at the expense of the other. And the same way that Rabbi Sacks says that we are the children of God, Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, Avinu Shebashamayim, our Father in heaven. So therefore, there is this idea that each of us has built a relationship with God according to our needs in our own unique way, the same way that we would build a relationship with our own children depending on their needs and their characters.
I think one of the ways that I have, in grappling with some of what we consider traditionally the polytheistic religions, and certainly Rabbi Sacks, doesn't necessarily address it, but one of the ways that I have been able to sort through it is Alan Goshen Gottstein brings in as an example the whole controversy around the Indian wigs, for the Shaitel crisis. Are we allowed to use wigs that were presumably, and I know that England played a strong part in that, in the research there, that were part of rituals. So Goshen Gottstein, he suggests that, well, wait a sec, are we even certain that it is polytheism? There is a God that Hindus believe in, and there are other pieces that, the same way that we have been able to navigate Christianity through the notion of shittuf, of partnership, and be able to land, at least in Ashkenazic literature, in a place that says, well, maybe it's not really polytheistic, maybe it's monotheistic, but just not for us. Goshen Gottstein says that probably there's no reason why the same principles couldn't apply to other religions, such as Hinduism. But that's obviously a whole different discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to give you the floor to do chapter 4.
Just beforehand, just to add on to what you were saying, Rabbi Friedman, I think it was the Meiri, I know we're short on time, but I think it was the Meiri who said that he considered idolatry as a moral error rather than a theological error. And
right.
Therefore, there was this idea that this may be the conduit for me to reach God, but there's no prohibition for non-Jews to use idols to reach God. As long as they are reaching God and believe in God, then that would not, that they would still be part of the nations and the children of God in serving the same God as ourselves. Just to add on to what you said.
Very
Thank you. Fascinating. So we move on now to chapter 4. Chapter 4 follows on from Rabbi Friedman, and it's the idea of the imperative of responsibility. And I think it's important, just to start off very briefly, in bearing in mind the backdrop. We always have to look at the books in the backdrop and timescale in which they were written. So we're dealing with, this was in the aftermath of 9/11, 2001, and there was, of course, huge upheaval and political insecurity. And Rabbi Sacks is wondering, with all the terrorism and the upheaval, where did this insecurity come from that gave rise in turn to the political and the religious extremism? I think in that year there was the rioting in Paris, there was rioting in Britain, and there were shuls being burned across Europe, amongst other things, as well as Palestinian suicide bombings. So there was tremendous insecurity, if we bear that in mind when we start considering what Rabbi Sacks is going to talk about. So again, where did this insecurity come from? So he said that in part it comes from the sheer pace of the technological, the cultural, and the economic transformations. If we consider the 20th century, the changes that we witnessed were simply unprecedented. At the beginning, flight was a dream, and then, of course, we know, we ended up by putting man on the moon. And he quotes Maimonides. Maimonides, he says as follows: man in his nature isn't capable of abandoning everything that a person has become accustomed to. In other words, we can adapt, but it takes a lifetime, or it takes much longer for us to be able to learn and change completely, to transform ourselves. And the illustration that Rabbi Sacks brings is that we find that in Egypt, after 210 years, we were able to leave Egypt in one day. But it took 40 years for us to be able to make that transformation and adaptation in ourselves to be able to move into the promised land. And if I may add on to that, that is one of the resistance that we find with the spies, that they didn't want. They didn't feel that we could cope with the changes that would come about from the utopian existence of the manna and the desert with the clouds of glory to plowing and working in the land of Israel. So what Rabbi Sacks is saying, and he goes on to discuss, is the idea that the world outside is changing much faster than our emotional responses. And that, of course, makes us all feel rather threatened. And if we consider it, change has become systemic. Jobs were for life. Marriages and relationships were for life. You lived in the same place. Some people lived in the same house. No longer was that the case. There was a feeling of a lack of control over our lives. Climate change, technological change, economic change. And therefore, Rabbi Sacks goes on to discuss and to analyze about the Western culture and a central paradox in choice itself. You see, he says that we have conflicting messages between economic markets on the one hand and life and social sciences on the other. On the one hand, we're all familiar and blessed and enjoy the choice that we have through consumerism, choices on the internet, in supermarkets, in everything that we have or want in life. And yet, on the other hand, there is this idea that we seem stuck. We don't have choices. In fact, if we think back to the quasi-scientific determinism, which was over the last 4 centuries, Rabbi Sachs says that they believed that choice was illusionary. Spinoza, Durkheim, Marx, and Freud. We are what we are not because of the choices we made. But he says that the social structures, the economic forces, the historical inevitability, or the child experiences, all were said to inhibit and hamper us from being able to make choices and to change as a result. So therefore, he says that we've lost confidence in choice itself. We feel givenness, we're stuck in life. And that, of course, in turn, gave us stability and predictability to life. So what caused the uncertainty? So fast forward from the 17th to the 20th century, there was a liberation, he says, of the individual from social constraints. We went and were transformed from feeling fate to choice, from community to society. Huge quick changes occurred and nothing was seen to confer meaning on our lives. Lives became lifestyles, relationships became transitionary, and jobs became contracts. Consumerism was the buzzword. You may recall that they had that t-shirt, the one who has the most toys is the one that wins. And therefore, it was, as Bauman points out, and quoted by Rabbi Sachs, that we went from a phase of pilgrims to being tourists, from society to becoming less like home and more like a hotel. We weren't connected to anything. Nothing was enduring beyond the self. Oscar Wilde, he said, defined the cynic as knowing the price of everything and the value of nothing. And as a result of everything becoming a market and a consumer domain, therefore everything could be bought, not just products, but services. And everything was outsourced. You have life coaches, you have personal trainers, everything was being taken over by the consumerism in which we lived. And in fact, I remember Rabbi Sachs, when he came to our shul, discussing this, the value of things as opposed to the price of things. And he said that he joked that there is even an outsourcing of thinking in our generation. And therefore, we valued less things that were truly of value. Relationships, we weren't interested in long-term relationships. We weren't interested in being told whether things were good or bad. And we outsourced most of what matters. There was a losing of sovereignty in our own lives. And therefore, when things would go wrong, we would feel a lack of control. It wasn't up to us. We didn't have a personal moral responsibility. Rabbi Sachs, in the second half of this chapter, fascinatingly goes on to discuss about morality and how that the Jewish take on morality can be of benefit in addressing these concerns. He says as follows. He said that 4,000 years ago, there emerged a very different concept of human life, that humans were not powerless in the face of the impersonal, that we could create, as we have done, families, communities, societies, and the ideals of love and fellowship and trust place the individual in the context of being valued, not for what they have, but for what the individual was. To value the we as well as the I. And therefore, in morality, he said, empowers us to humanize fate, which is locating the source of action in ourselves. It restores the idea of responsibility. It removes the randomness of life. Decisions that we take make a difference to everyone. Now, religious communities in which these values are sustained, not exclusively, because he admits that in philosophical systems it's also found, but what religions offered was not just something which philosophical systems saw in the abstract, but for religious faiths, it was the ideals that were embodied in life, in the lives of a community. And therefore, as Western culture chose to consciously or subconsciously dissolve the values and virtues that gave meaning to life, faith became the counterpoint to them, a form of a protest against its values. So the question which he addresses is, how do we live with moral difference, which is what we have, and yet sustain overarching communities? If we think about it, even within the faith communities, be it Muslims, Christians, Jews, we have our differences of opinion about issues. Take abortion or cloning, there are differences within us. And yet he says that the key is that we have conversation rather than debate, listening with respect, valuing the opinion of difference. Debates, one side wins, the other side loses. But when we are engaged in a conversation, friends, there are no winners and no losers. We are all enriched by hearing the different perspectives. We make space for another's perspective. And therefore, he says that in conclusion, there is no way of eliminating the objective conditions that we find of insecurity in our day and age. But he did argue that having a moral vision will help us deal with it. Morality restores responsibility, and it makes a difference to our future. We know that the future lies in our hands. Global capitalization, he says, it's not a runaway juggernaut that's out of control and that we can't steer. We all have the capability to create a caring, equitable society. Rabbi Friedman.
Thank you, Rabbi Hackenbruch. That's truly fascinating and inspiring summary of the thoughts that Rabbi Sacks expresses. One of the things that strikes me in what you've said is the choices that one makes, whether to simply fit into that mode of this is how it's been, this is how it's inevitably going to be, and saying, well, wait a second, let's steer that ship. We don't necessarily need to go down a path that we just have always been going down. There have been changes in the world, transformations in the world, and so that's going to necessitate transformations and new ways of thinking on our parts. In your interfaith work, have you found that to be the case, or how have you found that to be the case amongst various faith leaders? Are they thinking in different ways? Are those conversations able to find some sort of common ground, ways to communicate, ways to move the message forward without being in conflict for British society and beyond?
It's a good question, and I'll be honest with you, it's a question that I ask myself very often. I think that the first thing to say is that the only way forward is to keep having those conversations, to keep a dialogue open, so that we are able, even if we don't agree on issues, and even when there may be conflicts in the Middle East, whatever it may be, that flare up, that cause ruptures in our own community, we are able, and we have done, to be able to pick up the phone and speak one to another. But I think that one of the things that we have experienced, and I was involved in a very powerful project you may consider. It's called the Near Neighbor Project. And what it does is it takes different communities and you spend weeks on end discussing local issues. And I think that is the key. It's the small things in life that can make the big difference. We're not going to start, and I don't think Rabbi Sacks's vision and philosophy would be for us to start thinking that we start with the big things. We start locally and we look at the local issues. And there is so much commonality and issues that we have from, for example, COVID, the different responses that we've had and they've had, and how we can cooperate and work together through the Barnet Multi-Faith Forum and other such forums to be able to learn from each other and to cooperate and see how can we help you, or we can learn from what your expertise. So that is the first thing. The second thing I think is social action, which I think does and has made a big difference. Involving, sometimes it's more about what we do than what we say. Sometimes if we leave aside the issues and we just get on and do stuff, I think that sometimes a lot of the stuff that's on the side gradually becomes less important, or we can manage to overlook it. We have to learn to love each other for who we are and to respect the differences. That's the only way. But I have to say, from my personal experience, I've found an open door. We in the aftermath of the rioting in America, I called on a Pastor Ghiazi, and we had between two communities an interfaith, which was exceptionally powerful. And just having those conversations, I think in itself was exceptionally powerful meaning for both communities. And therefore, I think that we have to recognize these things. Rome wasn't built in a day. It takes a lifetime, and small steps will make a large difference.
We actually call after you for that. These are things that didn't happen historically, and all new ground that you're breaking. So thank you for really ultimately protecting the safety and security of our people and British society generally, and really beyond the world. I see there are some good and big questions coming in the comments. Okay. So maybe we'll go off script a little and jump ahead to something that's on probably a number of people's minds. But just before we do, I do want to encourage our viewers, if you do have questions, please do post them in the Facebook Live comment section. We can see them and we will try to get to them. There is a question about dealing with different moral approaches from our communities to the Haredi community. But before we get there, let's talk a little closer to this book, to the Dignity of Difference, between the differences between our communities and other faith communities. And like you mentioned, Rabbi Hackenbruch, when people had heard that this was the topic of conversation this evening, let's call it elephant in the room was version 1 versus version 2. So I'm going to, if I may, quote a couple of sentences, paragraphs that stirred up a little controversy in version 1 of the Dignity of Difference. And we can try and navigate where Rabbi Sacks was coming from, and how we feel about those comments, of course, with the greatest respect to Rabbi Sacks, one of the Gedolei Ador, greatest leaders of world Jewry of our generation. So Rabbi Sacks had written in version 1, number 1, God has spoken to mankind in many languages, through Judaism to the Jews, Christianity to Christians, Islam to Muslims. God is the God of all humanity, but no single faith is or should be the faith of all humanity. Number 2, no one creed has a monopoly on spiritual truth. No one civilization encompasses all the spiritual, ethical, and artistic expressions of mankind. In heaven there is truth, on earth there are truths. God is greater than religion. He is only partially comprehended by any faith. Number 3, each of us within our traditions must learn to listen and be prepared to be surprised by others. We must make ourselves open to their stories, which may profoundly conflict with ours. So, Rabbi Hackenbruch, first thoughts on what Rabbi Sacks meant, why he might have removed those thoughts, and whether you would echo those thoughts or consider them, as some in our community did, as bordering on heretical.
Okay. So I just want to make clear that I do want to go on to the Rika question afterwards, if you don't mind, when we finish this.
Absolutely.
Okay, because I think it's something that was on my mind. Okay. So I think by way of introduction, that we should recognize and appreciate that true leaders and thinkers are there to challenge us, and as Rabbi Sacks said, are there to be challenged. Now, when you're a leader, as you well are, Rabbi Friedman, an outstanding leader, you know that you set the pace. And when you set the pace, as you go on any tour, you'll know, sometimes you'll be accused of going too slow, and sometimes you'll be accused of going too fast. And it's a real delicate balance for any leader to get right. I think that Rabbi Sacks was and is and will be considered for generations to come as one of the great leaders and visionaries and thinkers who had tremendous courage. He was not afraid to have people that disagree with himself. But I think we should also bear in mind that there have been many controversies over many other Jewish thinkers that had original ideas. At the time, it was seen as radical, and it was something that was also, there were all types of accusations that were thrown up. I don't need to tell you, from Ramchal, Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Baal Shem Tov's books were burned, and also Rav David Sinzheim, the Yad David and the Talmud, also got into hot water about statements that he made, for example, about Napoleon in trying to make overtures to him, bearing in mind that Napoleon was in two minds as to where the Jews were sitting, whether they were a fifth column or not. So,
I mean, we can you talk about the Rambam. I mean, we've got Rabbeinu Yonah, a generation later, who had participated in the burning of the Rambam. Correct. And he himself came around and spent the rest of his life in a state of teshuvah, only willing to accept that God had forgiven him and that the Rambam, Maimonides, had forgiven him if he were to beg forgiveness at the Rambam's keva. So he spent years trying to make his way to Israel. He died en route. And yeah. No doubt the Rambam and Rabbeinu Yonah sitting together, having a chavrusa right now, probably a three-way with Rabbi Sacks.
Anyways, right. So going back to this issue, Rabbi Sacks, when he wrote this book, and he made clear when he wrote all of these books of this genre, were written. When I speak to you, I will speak to you in a dialogue that is conducive for us to be able to speak. Rabbi Sacks wrote these books predominantly for the wider community rather than our own community. And therefore, he wrote them in a way that they would be able to understand. And therefore, if moving on to the question which you posed, I think that Rabbi Sacks never retracted. He never retracted. In fact, there was Rabbi Sacks's second version was really the same as the first version. The only difference is he refined the way that he wrote those ideas and concepts, so that it would be something that would sit more comfortably with us. But in terms of the idea itself, if you look very closely, it hasn't really changed. The idea of recognizing and being able to see the godliness in every person, to recognize that if somebody else is serving God, that there could be spirituality in their service of God. It is not something that Rabbi Sacks changed between book 1 and book 2. So, for my mind, the concept, it was something which, in the way it was written, it was something which was rather a shock to the system. But the concept itself, I don't need to tell you, we don't have time to go through it, but it's certainly well grounded. Rabbi Sachs himself wrote over 100 sources subsequent to the first edition to share with the readers, and people could qualify and understand where he was coming from.
I think, one is reminded of the words in Pirkei Avot that says, Chacham hizaru b'divreichem. We have to be very careful, even when we are speaking the truth, that it is not misunderstood, misinterpreted, or taken out of context by people who are seeking to undermine the message. And perhaps that was what Rabbi Sachs recognized at this point. Make it clear, make it unambiguous, but absolutely, like you say, Rabbi Hackenbach, his thoughts have abundant evidence throughout Jewish tradition, and it's almost a shame that to state it in the clear terms that he did. Although one almost wonders, maybe from the Almighty, it was the controversy that had to propel the book to international stardom, and that's really had the message. When the classic idiom that says that the best way to get a book out there is to get it in Cherem. It shot to international fame on account of the little free advertising that he got. So it all comes from the Almighty.
Yeah. So yeah, agreed. I think the book would have gone to #1 in any case, because it is a phenomenal ideas and tremendous wisdom. But I think the central message is that we should reinforce, is, at least from my perspective, is that mainstream rabbinic teachings teach that wisdom and righteousness and the possibility of having a true relationship, and that's what Rabbi Sachs emphasized the second time around, the relationship with God is available to non-Jewish cultures and religions just as much as it is available to us. They had the covenant with God through the covenant of Noah and all his descendants, and therefore the tradition teaches that one doesn't have to be Jewish to know God or to know truth. And so there are many routes to reach God and to attain truth in this world. We have ours, and they have theirs.
So I just because of Chachamim hizaru b'divreichem, that we have to be very careful about the message that our viewers walk away with. I just want to share one idea to just fine tune one traditional idea. Rabbi Yaakov Emden in the 18th century, he taught that, or he believed that Jesus set out to teach pagans about Noahidism. And that's why we have this emphasis in Christianity on the 10 Commandments. Obviously, it was 7 commandments, but there was a Bible, and the Bible had 10 commandments. And so at some point it morphed into it. But that was the message. And even the Rambam talks about how Christianity is there in order to create this notion of monotheism and messianism that the world now is aware of. So I know we are tight for time. You wanted to address one of the questions in the comments, and so please, if you'd like to read it out. And if I may, I'm going to just take a moment to thank Edward Howard, our community director at HGSS, in the background, doing a fabulous job of keeping the program together, and all the fantastic work you do, Edward, for Norris Lee. Edward, if you would like to flash Rika's question on the screen, and Rabbi Hackenbach, if you'd like to read it out and speak to it.
Okay, well, I'm hoping we can have a little conversation and a chavrusa. Chavrusa is, it's a two-way street, Rabbi Friedman. You're not getting off the hook.
Of course, absolutely.
Good evening. A lovely warm response and polite response. Good evening, Rabbis Friedman and Hackenbach. How does your argument of a moral compass entrenched in halacha explain the current response and actions by certain segments of the Haredi society? Okay. So I want to start by stating the obvious. What is our reaction and our response as Jews, as human beings, but as Jews first and foremost, when we see these pictures, we hear these headlines. So of course it should be that we are absolutely devastated, and any wrongdoing, any law breaking, we condemn in the strongest possible terms. That's point number one. But I think there is a second point, and that is the whole message of dignity of difference. And please come in when you want, Rabbi Friedman, is the idea that communities used to be ghettoized. And then, of course, there was this multiculturalism, and therefore we are now trying to complement and bring out and become enlarged and emboldened by the sharing of our culture and ideas and strengths that we all have. And I think there is in certain sectors of our community the ghetto mentality, and the fact that we are not sharing and working together and living together. I think it puts up barriers. It leads to a lot of stereotypes, labeling, and we cannot help them. They clearly need our help. And I hope that one of the positives that will come out of this is that we should try to find ways and means, rather than just condemning, which is obviously point number one, but there needs to be, hopefully, an ongoing conversation, an inter-Jewish faith conversation and dialogue. Because if we draw up the bridge, we're not going to help anyone. And in fact, it was telling that it was after, I think it was the Jewish JLC, the Jewish Leadership Council, that they met with them, members met with them, I think members of your shul, and they sat down and they discussed about the issues. All of a sudden, they came up with 30 establishments that would put up signs that they're keeping the rules of COVID and everything else. A lot of it is because I think that they are very insular and not fully cognizant and appreciative of the issues of the day. There is never excuse. Halacha is quite clear. And personally, I have, behind the scenes with trying to work with other doctors, try to get that message through to segments of our community that are not listening.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Hagebrach.
It starts from the top, but we have to lead by example, Rabbi Friedman, honestly.
So I think, thank you. I think that, if anything, maybe this for me would be the elephant in the room that Rabbi Sachs perhaps doesn't address. As much as we talk about tolerance, there are going to be some red lines that we simply don't agree with. If there is a Sharia court, before we get to our specifics within the Jewish community, if there's a Sharia court that says if somebody steals, we chop off their hand, then we have to have the red lines where we say, no, that's not what we do in as Brits. If that's incompatible with our view of morality for British society. And I think that part of the conversation is stripping down within our various traditions what exactly are the core principles and what are things that have attached themselves to our societal norms in those various societies that might have worked wherever we were, but don't work, are unacceptable in British society, and be able to say, you know what? Some things got to go. Some things are unacceptable. It might have worked to cheat on your taxes back in Eastern Europe, where the government was out to put your kids in the army as the Cantonists did and strip them of all their Judaism, and the only way around it was to be as avoiding as possible of government legislation. That's not acceptable for our British values, and we have to call out our brothers and sisters who are living in these archaic with these archaic values that might have been necessary for survival, but are absolutely wrong. And whether that's non-Jewish groups or Jewish groups, if it's beyond the pale, it's beyond the pale.
Agreed. And there's no question about that. And I think a lot of it does come from the culture and the mindset that has been transferred when they came over to this country, and it stayed with them. And as much as their traditions are wonderful, clearly, you know, abiding by the law, contributing to society are essential. I think there is also a danger always when we have such a conversation of labeling everyone and tarnishing everyone with the same brush. And I think we should qualify that, you know, there are many outstanding organizations and many outstanding people that are adhering to the laws and keeping not just the laws of COVID, but, you know, the laws of in general.
Absolutely.
And I think that's an important point. But I think that once obviously we have to call a spade, but once we've done that, you know, I think that we have to go beyond that. We want things to change. Rabbi Sacks started by saying that where there is difference between faiths, then there has to be conversation rather than debate. So there has to be an ongoing dialogue and conversation. We used to have a bridge. It was Rabbi Pinter. Rabbi Pinter was an outstanding leader. I think just before your time, he sadly passed away at the beginning of COVID. I don't know if you got to meet him, but there was that bridge, and we need a leader of his caliber and ilk that is willing to come across and be able to understand and appreciate things from our side, and then have people that are able to go back and to translate that into a method and means that will be able to be heard in their own communities. But 100%, I'm with you. I'm with you 100%, and I have condemned in the strongest possible terms. What I'm saying is, and now what? Condemning isn't going to make a paradigm shift. We need, and I'm all about this, we have to try and say, let's sit down, or let's create the means for being able to have those communications with the leadership so that they can understand and impress upon them the way things are being perceived and the dangers. You know, we're talking about pikuach nefesh. So it's something that I'm sure you and I can work on after this. Thank you for volunteering.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Hackenbrock. It's been such a privilege to chat with you this evening. I think this has been an extremely stimulating conversation. I've learned a lot. I look forward to learning with you on many more occasions in the years ahead. And wish you Hatzlacha Rabbah in everything you do for the Woodside Park Synagogue community and for Anglo Jewry generally. Yasher Koach and Hatzlacha.
Thank you, Rabbi Friedman. Thank you, Hampstead Garden Suburb. Wishing everyone bracha b'atzlacha, and should keep safe and keep well. And please God, we look forward to coming together in person only on Simchas in the future. Keep safe, keep well. Thank you so much.
Amen.